Hello everyone, this is going to be a narrated video of this Leonidas drawing, and I'm going to be doing a voiceover commentary for the time-lapse of the drawing process. But you should stick to the end of the video because I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the composition and some other interesting details. I'm starting out with this sketch which looks like a mess, but I've already planned where I'm going to put everything. I took a while to plan this composition, and now I'm starting out with a dirty Totilion, which I'm using to shade a little bit of the background around the Leonidas head, because here's the left side of his face and body is going to be a lot lighter because of the light source coming from the left. So I'm going to want some contrast between his left side and the background, which is going to be a little darker. And now I'm using a charcoal pencil to add some of these darker details on the face and hair. In most of my recent drawings I used these woodless pencils, and I used two woodless pencils, one soft one and one medium. The medium one can be sharpened better and holds the tip better, but the softer ones can be blended more easily and are good for covering larger, darker areas. He's wearing some kind of a band, so I'm gonna have to work on that a little bit to make it look a little more realistic. Right now I'm just working on the hair a little bit, and now I'm moving on to the beard. I have to tell you that in my reference photo it was kind of difficult to tell where the beard ends and the neck begins, so I had to figure that out somehow without looking at other reference photos, because I couldn't really be bothered to check any more of them. And when it comes to drawing a face and facial features, I wanted him obviously to look like Gerard Butler. I wanted to achieve some likeness. I could have gone for a random masculine character, but I wanted him to look like the actor who played Leonidas in the movie. So, like I said, when drawing these facial features, I know that most of the educated artists wouldn't like what I'm doing, which is drawing some of the details and then moving on to shading, but my process is slightly different, and first I lay down some of the detail, then I move on to the bigger shadows, bigger relationships, and then I go back to the details again. So that's normally my process when drawing faces, and it seems to work for me, so I'm gonna stick to it. So now that I drew some of the detail, you'll see me going in with Totilion and then adding some of these larger shadows and trying to suggest the shape and the topography of his face. The interesting thing about Butler is that he always has this, he has a big chin, and he always has this expression like he's chewing on something. So I'm going to have to capture that. And this large beard is adding to that impression. And like I said, I used the Totilion to shade the background to the left of him, but the edge is still not very clean, so I'm going to have to clean that up, because I'm going to want a sharper and cleaner edge there. In this process, while I'm using a brush to add a little more value to the face, I can sometimes remove some of these larger shadows that I created, so sometimes I need to go back in and go over some of these areas which need to be a little bit darker so that I can make sense of his face, of the shape of his face. And he also has a scar, so I need to put that in as well. Like I said, I could have gone for a random guy, but I wanted him to look like Gerard Butler, so I'm working on that now. It's going to take a few minutes for me to achieve proper likeness. What's important for me is to get that beard right and to get his grim face to look right. Now moving on to the shoulder a little bit. But I'm still going to be going back to the face and adding some more detail and fixing it a little bit because I wasn't quite happy with the way he looked. As for the movie, I'm not a big fan, honestly. I know that it was based on a comic book, and these adaptations don't always work that well. It's a different kind of medium. I didn't think that the plot was developed very good, or that it was very convincing. So the movie had its flaws. Not much characterization either. But it had a captivating atmosphere, especially at the beginning of the movie. So I can understand why some people like it. Like I said, Leonidas, even though I don't really like the movie that much, Leonidas here is an interesting character to draw. An interesting, masculine, grim-faced character. So it's going to make for an interesting drawing. I think I finally got the face to look right here, and now I can move on to other parts because that was kind of my priority, and I'm still fidgeting with it, this time with a little bit of colored pencil, which I occasionally use to add some of the details. He's wearing this headband. I also need to add some detail to it and to fix his hair. But I think the face is looking pretty good right now. Now I'm trying to clean up that edge. This is very important because we need a clean edge there and we need a lot of contrast there. So like I said, the light source is coming from the left and above, and our drawing is going to have to reflect that. Each part of it, including the face and the hair and the side of the face and the ears and the shoulder, everything. We have to stay consistent with the light source. Now I'm working on this arm and hand and his spear. And initially I kind of simplified the hand a little bit too much, so I had to work in some more detail and fix the shape of the fingers and everything. As you can see, the spear and the arm is foreshortened because it's closer to the viewer. So the tip looks a lot larger and thicker. And what you can see me doing now is drawing with my tortillon, because I want to make the tip of the spear appear a little bit blurry. Normally when I want things to look sharp, I use a pencil and I use cleaner edges. Here I don't want cleaner edges, I want it to look softer and blurrier because it's out of focus, and the focus is on his face I wanted the part where his shoulder and his head is to be the central part of the drawing, and the one that draws your attention first. That's why we have most of the contrast and the cleanest edges there. And here in the foreground, this area where the spear is going to be slightly out of focus. That's why I didn't use a pencil to draw it, because I didn't want these clean rough edges and rough textures. You can see that I sharpened my soft charcoal pencil, and that left a lot of charcoal dust, which I'm now using with a large brush to spread it around and cover the background. I'm gonna blend that in and try to make it look as soft as possible, but at this stage it looks kind of patchy. I'm gonna have to blend that properly and make it look more even and smooth and remove those patches. So it's gonna take a lot more work with smaller brushes and some other blending tools, because I don't want it to look distracting. I don't want it to look like there's a lot of detail or texture there. I just want a very simple background which allows you to focus on the character in the foreground. So I'm mostly using my brushes to blend that in and to make it look smoother. Another thing you'll often see me doing in many of my drawings is when I want to make an area smoother and blend it properly, I often use white charcoal, which is what I did now. That white pencil that I used, that was white charcoal. And when I use white charcoal and gently blend it with a brush, it tends to remove this patchiness, and it tends to blend very smoothly. It doesn't actually make it a lot lighter, even though it is white charcoal. It kind of makes it more even gray. The darkest areas become a little bit lighter, but the lightest areas become a little bit darker, so the background becomes a lot more even. I used white charcoal a lot for these situations where I can't really seem to blend everything in properly by just using my blending tools and brushes. So I think the background looks pretty good now. And I also need to make this area around the arm a little bit darker because I need contrast there. And now you can see me trying to refine the shape of the hand a little bit more. Adding more texture and more detail to it. You can see that here on his bicep and around his shoulder, we need to show, when you extend your arm, when you lift your arms, your deltoids contract, so we need to show that by emphasizing that transition between the bicep and the deltoid muscles of the shoulder. A few more details on the hands. Now you can see that I'm starting to work on his clothes a little bit, but using a black color pencil to clean up some of these edges and maybe add a tiny bit of value here and there just to make the background appear even more smooth, even more even in some of these areas where it appears a little bit patchy. So at this point it's just cleaning things up, but I'm mostly satisfied with the way it looks. Also need to take away a little bit of value here and there, add a little bit of value here and there. That's how it goes. It sometimes takes a little bit of patience. Now I'm moving on to his torso, and he's not wearing any armor, consistent with the movie and the comic book. First I'm going to be drawing some of these darker areas to suggest the shape of some of these larger muscles. And then I'm going to be adding some more value and texture on top of them, and then blending that in, and then going back in and adding more darker value in between the muscles. And I'm doing the same thing with the background that I did on the left. I sharpen a soft pencil and then use that charcoal dust to create some value in the background. I'm often like that when I work. I'm all over the place. I start on one area and then switch to the other. Sometimes I find it difficult to focus on just one part, because skipping from one part to the other a little bit allows me to keep the bigger picture in mind, if that makes sense. Now I'm just going to keep blending this torso and his muscles. I'm using a soft charcoal pencil to shade this, and even using a little bit of cross-hatching here and there, but it doesn't really matter because I'm going to be blending those lines, so I'm not going to leave it like that, obviously. I'm pretty sure his body didn't look like that in real life, so there was probably a lot of makeup there. He may have also had a personal trainer for the movie, and who knows, maybe even used some steroids. You can see that I wasn't happy with the amount of texture there, so I used a little bit of white charcoal to soften it, and then I'm going back in, drawing some of these darker areas to make these abs stand out a little more. But I'm going to soften these lines a little bit until I'm happy with the way the torso looks. I want it to look realistic. I don't want it to look too shiny or glossy, like it's made of bronze. I want more texture there. I want it to look like skin. And I'm trying to produce texture both by using the pencil and by using the pencil eraser. I decided that I need to make this shoulder and bicep a little bit darker, and to add a little more contrast between the deltoid and the bicep. He also seems to have either some scars or some blood on his chest, so I added some detail there as well. And adding some detail to this clasp on his robe as well. And soon I'm going to be moving on to the shield, hopefully, once I'm done with this. Just a few more highlights with the eraser. Now moving on to the shield, and I deliberately wanted the shield to have some of these cracks, like it's battle worn, and in order to make them more realistic I need to shade them properly, keeping in mind where the light source is. I also decided to add a few arrows here, but I also need to make the arrows look wider at the end, so they need to be foreshortened a little bit as well. I'm shading the area around the shield because I'm gonna want the contrast between the shield and the background as well. This is the Spartan sign on the shield. I'm gonna shade that as well. I am deliberately going to try to leave a little bit of that rough texture on the shield because I want it to look like rough, worn out metal with some cracks and dents and stuff like that. But because it's a round object, I need to shade it to create volume. The lower part and the part to the right is going to be a little bit darker. I'm also adding a little bit of shadow to these arrows to make it look more 3D, and adding some shading and highlights to the shield to make those cracks a little more realistic and a little more 3D. I'm removing the tape now because it's almost done. This is a part that a lot of people find very satisfying. I actually find it a little bit stressful. So I remove the masking tape, and this is what the drawing looks like. Now I'm just going to be signing it here. I think it's a good inconspicuous place for a small signature. And that's about it. Okay, now I want to sum up some of the things that I was talking about, and I already talked about this in one of my previous videos and also during this time lapse, but I just want to sum up some of these things and elaborate on some of them. First, let's talk a little bit about the composition, because I had to make certain changes to my reference photo, and this just shows how many important decisions you need to make when approaching drawing. And obviously composition is one of the most important thing when starting to work on a drawing. This part here didn't exist in the reference photo, and this part here was a lot longer, so I wanted to make the drawing a little more balanced. I wanted to make the picture a lot more balanced, because in the original photo there was some Spartan shields here and everything. I didn't want to put that in. I just wanted to focus on Leonidas. So the first couple of decisions I had to make was to introduce a shield here, and obviously I added some detail to it, such as adding these arrows to show that he was in battle and stuff like that. But I also had to foreshorten this spear a little bit more. So how do you do that? Well, foreshortening is when you're trying to show that you're viewing an object from this angle, and it appears shorter and wider. The end that is closer to you appears shorter and wider. So if this is the spear, if this is the normal appearance of the spear, when it's foreshortened, it's going to look more like this. And the same thing is going to happen to Leonidas's arm and some other objects. Now, what I wanted to place in the center of my drawing was the triangle of these three things. I wanted his head, the shoulder of the arm holding the spear, and this back to be more or less in the center of this drawing. I want them to be the focus of this drawing. And this also created some other problems for me because I had an empty space here and here, so I kind of decided to compensate for that by adding more value in those areas to balance it out. If I couldn't balance it out with detail, then I sort of tried to balance it out in terms of value, and I think it worked. There are some other details that I talked about a little bit during the time lapse, which I want to go over in more detail now. For example, this detail here on the shield is very interesting because it shows how important it is to keep in mind where your light source is and how it reflects on even the smallest details in your drawing. So if you look at these scores and nicks and this little damage on the shield, what really helps you sell it as a realistic 3D object is the shading. So if you look at this score, which was presumably made by a sword, the lower part of it is lighter and the upper part of it is darker. So this is creating an illusion that there was a cut or a dent made into it because the light source is coming from above. This part here naturally is going to be darker, and this part here, the lower part, is going to be getting light from above, and that's why it's lighter. So we did the same thing here with this Spartan sign here on the shield, and also on this part of the shield, which is rounded. We wanted to show that it is a slightly round object, and this part here is getting more light. Of course, the shadows on these arrows which are sticking out are also an important bit. Finally, a few more words about edges. When you have something that is in the foreground here and we want to make it look like it's slightly out of focus, you should avoid clean edges. I mean, look at this area here. This has very clean edges, and this area here also lots of detail, texture, and cleaner edges. This area here has less texture and it's kind of blurry, and you can see that these edges are also blurry, that they're not very clean. This is what you do when you're trying to achieve that out of focus look. When you want to have focus on a certain area of your drawing, you want cleaner edges. Now here, because the light source is coming from this side and from the above, I needed this part to be lighter, and I needed a fair amount of contrast between his shoulders and neck and head and the background. So I had to make this area a little bit darker, and I needed a fairly clean edge here as well as in some of these other areas. So these are some of the things that I wanted to talk about. You can see how even when you are creating a realistic drawing like this, and some people would say that you're just copying a reference photo, this is far from the truth, because you need to make a ton of decisions about your drawing if you want to improve its appearance, if you want to improve how it will look to the viewer, if you want to add in certain details or improve the composition or just make some changes that are more to your liking. So it's a very, very complex process that requires a lot of decisions. I hope you enjoyed this commentary, and I'll see you in the next video.